Hi, welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen E. Andrews, writer, bookseller, collector, author of 100 must-read science fiction novels, and the voice of experience on SF BookTube. Today, I'm going to review a new book, a new collection, and talk about the person who is still the most dangerous writer in science fiction. He was the most dangerous writer in science fiction in the 60s and the 70s and onwards, and he's back, and he is still the most dangerous writer in science fiction, and I'm going to tell you why you should read his work. And I'm talking about Harlan Ellison. But today we're going to review the just published collection from Herald Classics, this lovely trade paperback of Harlan Ellison's Greatest Hits. If you know who Harlan Ellison is, that's all very well and groovy. If you don't, I'm going to talk to you a little about him, and I'm going to do an in-depth review of the entire book. As you can see, what we have here is a lovely trade paperback in wraps. They're not French flaps, they're wraps with decorated end papers, green with little white stars, and everybody who sees the book says, wow, an amazing cover. Really, really nice, and this is available both in the USA and the UK, so you can buy it now. Great stuff. It retails about $14.99 in the UK, I think. It's an absolute delight for me to see this book come into print, because it's almost the only time in my 40 years working in the British book trade, in large bookshops, small bookshops, medium-sized bookshops, high street bookshops, campus bookshops, mail order, that I've been able to sell and stock a Harlan Ellison book in a mass market paperback. This is because Ellison's works were going out of print in the UK in the early 1980s, and when I began bookselling in 1984, you could get Shatterday, which is that book there, in paperback. There were two collections called The Time of the Eye and All the Sons of Fear, and they'd pretty much gone out of print by 1985, and there were no mass market paperbacks available after that point. All I could sell in recent years were print-on-demand, generic-looking trade paperbacks which weren't that attractive, that didn't have great paper, that didn't have attractive jackets. But it's lovely to see a proper edition of some of Ellison's best stories. And having been a Harlan Ellison nut since 1980, it's an absolute joy for me to be able to have this in stock where I work and to sell it. And it is selling, is the good news. The agony of decades of selling science fiction without Ellison on my SFF shelves at work is over. So over the last 40 years, I've wanted desperately to introduce my customers to arguably the best science fiction story writer ever, and I've generally not been able to do so. There were a few things published by iBooks that appeared briefly in the UK. You mostly had to get them on import. In the States, it was always different, and Ellison moved away from large publishers to small publishers and specialists and print on demand as his life went on. Because even though he's still the most dangerous man in SF, he's dead. He died a few years ago. He's no longer with us. Now, Harlan Ellison is a writer who is best read for the first time by young readers. So if you're under 55, you have probably missed out because his work hasn't been available. In the USA, as I say, it hasn't been so bad. His books continued to appear until about 20 years ago. So I'm going to review this book, and I'm going to explain why Ellison is still dangerous and why you have to read him if you're interested at all in high quality science fiction and fantasy. So you're wondering, who was this guy? Let me tell you a little bit about him. Harlan Ellison died in 2018. He was 84, I think, and he was the most decorated writer in history. Not just the most decorated writer in the history of genre fiction, but he won more awards and prizes for writing than anyone in history. So why haven't you heard of him? Because he predominantly wrote short stories, and short stories are increasingly unpopular with the readership. Why that is baffles me, because short stories are usually the place where writers do their best work, because he was a difficult character to work with. By the mid-1980s, major publishers wanted nothing to do with him. That was largely of his own making, but of course they made mistakes too. So if you're not an avid fan of short fiction and you didn't follow small press publishers over the last 30 years, you'd miss his work. And he did write novels very early in his career. They're quite short, they're not all SF, and he never really bothered with the novel as a form. He did a lot of screenwriting in the 1960s, which he made quite a bit of money at, and he wrote loads and loads of short stories, as I say, from the 50s right the way up until his death. He also wrote novelettes and novellas, and he was very decorated. If you look at the number of Hugo and Nebula Awards he won, it's absolutely astonishing. As a screenwriter in the 1960s, he wrote lots for television. He wrote episodes of Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, episodes of The Outer Limits. He wrote an episode of Star Trek. He wrote an unfilmed screenplay for I, Robot. And his novella, A Boy and His Dog, was filmed in the mid-1970s. His work also inspired the famous SF film The Terminator, which was inspired by a short story called Soldier, which was later filmed for The Outer Limits and inspired at least parts of The Terminator. Why do I like Ellison so much? I love Ellison because his writing is very, very fine. He focused on short forms because they were best to express what he wanted to say. Every single word counts. Every single word was chosen for impact. Somebody once said to Ellison, "You only write like that to shock." And he said, "Of course I do. I want your attention. I want you to see what I'm saying. I want you to look at what I'm saying." And it wasn't just that, a cheap hack can shock if he times things right. But Ellison wrote very, very beautifully. And my old friend Christopher Priest once said that Ellison's reputation settled on a handful of sensationalist short stories. And there's a certain degree of truth in that. But they weren't just sensationalist, they were sensational. They were powerful and pointed and dark and loving and intense. And I can't say any more about them. You just have to read them for yourself. They are stories with a lot of humanity, but a lot of ire. Ellison was a little guy. He was small. And as a kid, he had a rough time. And, he never sort of got over that. And he remained an angry guy all his life. But it was because he wanted to see justice. Sometimes that anger went too far, and he was too uncompromising in his anger in his dealings with ordinary people and his dealings with publishers, readers, fans, what have you. And that didn't serve him well because he ended up being dropped by a lot of publishers. And that's why you haven't heard of a lot of his work. But his work's really important. So now we're going to talk about why you should read this book. So how did the editor of this book compile it? Greatest hits, that implies something, doesn't it? It implies best-selling, most revered, whatever you want to call it. But what he actually did, the editor Michael J. Straczynski, he went for the stories which had won the most awards or been nominated the most. So it really is on that basis. One caveat I would make is that even though these are the stories which won the most awards, they aren't essentially the best ones in my opinion. If I were doing my best of Harlan Ellison, a lot of these stories would be here, some of them wouldn't be, because I firmly believe that Ellison did his best work in the 1960s and 1970s, and even though he wrote science fiction, fantasy, horror, general fiction, essays, all sorts of things, I really believe that his finest work was his science fiction. Bearing in mind those criteria for selecting the stories for this collection, my issue would be that the biggest hit of all is missing. And the biggest hit of all, in my opinion, and it also won the Nebula Award, was A Boy and His Dog. And A Boy and His Dog was a really important story. It shocked a lot of people at the time. It still shocks people now. It was made into a film in the mid-70s called A Boy and His Dog by L.Q. Jones. And it's a good little film, but the story is out this world. It is the very, very finest post-apocalyptic story I've ever read. It makes the road look like a picnic. It really is quite something. So the absence of A Boy and His Dog from this book is a major flaw. However, there is the point that fairly recently, a few years back, there was a collection put together by Subterranean Press, which included A Boy and His Dog, its prequel Eggsucker, and a screenplay for an unfilmed TV show, possibly a film called See Spot Run. And the intention was that Ellison would eventually build the stories up about the characters from A Boy and His Dog and turn them into a novel. And it never happened. And I guess we knew it would never happen as well. So that is a major, major flaw. If you want to know more about A Boy and His Dog, if you look at the video I linked to at the end of this video, to my review of the story collection, which is entitled The Beast That Shouted Love at the Heart of the World, which is one of my favorite collections of all time, and I cover A Boy and His Dog in there. So do look at that. So that for me is the major flaw. Okay, what about the collection as a whole? I'm going to talk you through the stories and tell you what I think of it as a whole and give you a bit of an insight into the material itself. The book is divided into sections, they're thematic sections, and the first one is called Angry Gods. The second section is called Lost Souls. The third section is called The Passage of Time. A fourth section is called The Lighter Side, which of course, as you'd expect, is more humorous stories. And it finishes with a section entitled The Last Word, which contains one story. And that story is All the Lies That Are My Life from 1981, which was nominated for the Hugo Award. And it first appeared in an abridged form in that magazine there. That's a copy of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction from back at that time, late 70s, early 80s. And it's in that collection there. So if you ever see that, pick it up. It's rather nice. I'll just show you the artwork because this is a particularly nice edition of fantasy and science fiction, and there's Harlan Ellison on the cover there. Isn't that lovely? So there we go. I'm not a big magazine collector, but now and again I'll see something which is important to me and I'll snap it up. So looking at the opening of this with Angry Gods, there's 5 stories. The first of which is Repent, Harlequin, Said the TikTok Man from 1966, which won the Hugo Award, the Nebula Award, and the 2015 Prometheus Hall of Fame Award. The important awards are the early ones, the ones which are long established. Now, of course, the Hugo Award, the World Science Fiction Achievement Award, to give it its proper name, is basically a popularity poll. It's what fans attending the Worldcon everywhere vote for. The Nebula Award was a new award in the late 60s, and it was an award given by writers, by the Science Fiction Writers of America, SFWA, a professional organization. You had to be a published SF author, I think, with at least one novel and several stories under your belt before you could apply to join. Now it seems that people are buying their way in, and it's not the same as it was. Also, the Hugo Award really lost all its credibility about 20 years ago when a J.K. Rowling book won, which, you know, J.K. Rowling's popular, she's popular with fans of science fiction and fantasy. However, it's not great art, let's be honest. It's entry-level stuff. And if that alienates you, then this book is not for you, believe you me. This is altogether tougher. Repent, Harlequin, Said the TikTok Man is a short story about a dystopian society and about a jester-like figure called the Harlequin who entertains people by being late, by being naughty in public, and generally not being a conformist. But unfortunately, the TikTok Man, who manages the clocks in this future dystopian society, who makes sure that everything runs on time, is looking out for him. So it's a little bit like 1984 in miniature. It's a very funny story. It's a very good story. It's a story that celebrates the joy of anarchy and of not obeying the rules. And even though it's quite witty and in some ways slight in that effect, it does have a very serious message, and that comes across really well. And it's a great story, one of the great dystopian stories. The next story is one called I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, which has become really, really famous over the last 20 years. It's always been a famous SF story, but it's become a really famous one, and I'm not quite sure why, but it's something that young people seem to have heard of. And I actually was asked for it the other day, and it's the only time I've ever been asked for it. It was just before this book came in, and there used to be a collection called I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. And it's a celebrated story set in a future where an artificial intelligence has taken over the earth and has killed everybody apart from a handful of people who it keeps in a system of underground caves. Now, this AI is basically a large supercomputer. It doesn't have an ambulatory body, but it is all powerful, and it basically tortures these people. And it's a very gruesome story. It's a very frightening story. It doesn't pull any punches, and it's become really famous. So it is a science fiction horror story about the danger of AI. And it's extremely good, extremely powerful. It is one of the more sensationalist stories that Ellison wrote, but it won the Hugo Award in 1967, and it has become famous in its own right. So that's a great one. So there's 2 really strong stories to begin this collection. Then you get a story called The Deathbird, which was published in 1974, which was the head story in a collection called Deathbird Stories, which was one of the very first Ellisons I bought. And it's an experimental story about theology, about individuality, about the love of a man for his pet, which is an autobiographical element here that comes in from Ellison. He writes about his dog. He writes about when he was a boy. And it's a really fascinating story, and it's quite surreal. And it shows Ellison really at his peak of American New Wave science fiction writing. Now, American New Wave SF writing was different to British New Wave SF writing. Generally speaking, it wasn't as experimental, it wasn't as modernist, and it wasn't as daring. It was more about breaking taboos, because America was a little bit more straight-laced than the UK. It was more about religious taboos, sexual taboos, what have you. Whereas in the UK, things were a little bit more relaxed and swinging, strangely enough. So The Deathbird shows Ellison at that point, and it is indeed something to do with death, and it's a very fine story indeed. This is followed by a more recent story, Chatting with Anubis from 1995, which won the Bram Stoker Award and the Death Realm Award. Now, I'll be honest, I don't know what the Death Realm Award is. It's obviously a horror award. And this story is one that I was unfamiliar with. I will say that even though I have loads of Ellison books and I've read them all, the later things went on, the less impressed I was with the stories. They had less power. They lacked the electricity and savagery and burning ire that the early stories have. And very often motifs were repeated. And to me, Chatting with Anubis, which is a story about discovering something underneath the earth, two archaeologists discover something, that to me felt a little bit like a much earlier story and didn't feel as strong. So that was kind of the weaker one, really. But the Angry God section closes with an absolute sterling Ellison tale, The Whimper of Whipped Dogs from 1973. Now that's a proper title, The Whimper of Whipped Dogs. And that was the opening story, I seem to recall, in Deathbird Stories, and it won the Edgar Allan Poe Award. Now, the Edgar Allan Poe Award is for crime fiction, and of course it's named after Edgar Allan Poe because he basically invented crime fiction. So if you win the Edgar Award, as it's known short, that's really quite something. And, you know, it was one of those things that I think that's 73. I think in 74, I believe it was won by Schwall and Wahlöö, the Swedish crime writers, and they were the first non-Americans to win it. So that was really quite something. The Whimper of Whipped Dogs is a really powerful story, and it's based on something which happened in New York. One day, 26 people, I think it was 26, who lived in an apartment block which had a central courtyard, looked out of their window and saw a woman called Kitty Genovese being murdered, stabbed to death, and nobody did anything. And this story starts from that event with one of the people who viewed that event, a fictionalized person, not a real person, and the strange phenomena that hovered above that event. And it implies that there was some sort of supernatural presence. A very powerful story, very violent and uncompromising, and it asks serious questions about our morality when we sit back and watch instead of taking action. That in itself is typical of Ellison. He was very, very big on social justice, and the end paper of this book, the end flap I should say, makes a big deal about this, and it says that he marched with Martin Luther King Jr. from Selma to Montgomery, was a vocal supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment, served as a mentor to Octavia Butler, and was vehemently anti-Vietnam War. He was a protest type writer, he was a polemicist, so you know, you do get this burning ire coming through, and that's typical of his work. The second section of the book opens with a very wonderful story, which I first read in Shatterday. This copy of Shatterday I bought remaindered in 1982, and it cost me £1. And I'd already read a fair whack of Ellison then. I was delighted to find it, and so I managed to get it before the paperback came out. It was remaindered pretty quickly. It sadly didn't do very well. And Jeff D is 5 is that story, published in 1977. And Jeff D is 5 won the British Fantasy Award, the Hugo Award, the Nebula Award, and it was also the 1999 Locus Poll winner for Best Short Story of All Time. Now, if you know what Locus is, Locus was the science fiction newspaper which ran for years and years and years. It's a website now, I think, and I used to get it really regularly all the time, and it was what you read if you were a serious fan, if you were a professional in the field. Everybody read Locus. It was a great way of keeping up what was happening in the world of SF and fantasy and horror, particularly SF. So the readers were really engaged with the genre. So when they were asked what was the best short story of all time, it was Jeff D is 5. And Jeff D is 5 is a wonderful story about two boys who are friends, and as they grow up, and mature. One of them becomes an ordinary guy. He has a job, a home, a career, what have you. But his friend Jeffy stays small, except he doesn't. He matures physically, but Jeffy has learning difficulties and remains like a child. And he's charming and funny. And the two boys stay friends into their maturity, into their late 20s, and they still play together like kids. But then something happens to Jeffy, and it's a story about nostalgia and longing and memory and things from the past which haunt us that we can't escape from. And it's also about the crushing power of modern mass media, and it's a wonderful, wonderful story. So I'm delighted to see it in here, and it's always a joy to read. I've read it many times. I wouldn't say it's my favourite Ellison story. I would give that to A Boy and His Dog. But of the more good-hearted ones, it really is quite something. So it's a great, great story, and all those awards. It's followed then by a story called Pretty Maggie Money Eyes from 1967, which I've also read many times, and it was nominated for both the Hugo and Nebula Award in 67, but didn't win. In 1967, Ellison won the Hugo Award for I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. And because he wrote in different lengths, short stories, novellas, novelettes, he would often get nominated in more than one category. So that was quite a big thing. And Pretty Maggie Money Eyes is about a woman who is a bit of a player, and she is quite desperate, and she plays a slot machine in Las Vegas, and something untoward and very strange happens. And it is about that, and it's about a guy who stumbles across this slot machine sometime later, and the slot machine has an unusual quality. And it's a really great story, fantastic story, read it many times. It's followed by Saturday, the title story of that collection there. And Saturday is quite short, but it's one of Ellison's more mature works. It was published in 1980. It was nominated for the Nebula Award, and it was filmed for a late Twilight Zone episode as well. And Saturday is really, really good. It's the sort of story that somebody like Paul Auster or Georges Louis Borges would have written. It's about a guy who discovers he has a double, but it comes across in quite an unusual way, and it's about a conflict between these two variants of the same human being. And it's a really, really good story. It's very subtle. And towards the end of the 70s, Ellison had moved away from the more nuts and bolts, hard SF type things, which he'd been writing in the 50s and 60s. He wrote a lot of things about aliens, space travel, alien invasion, post-apocalyptic stories, and he moved into slightly more mature, more near-future things, and more fantasy-oriented things as well. More fantastic, I would say, more fabular. And yeah, absolutely great stuff. The Lost Soul section then continues with a longer piece, which I first read when it was first published, and that's Mephisto in Onyx. And Mephisto in Onyx was published as a hardcover by Zeissing. I've got my copy here upstairs, and it was done in a landscape format like that, which I absolutely hated. And I hadn't read it since I first bought it, so I reread it for this review. And Mephisto in Onyx won the Bram Stoker Award, the Locus Award. It was nominated for the Hugo Award, also for the Nebula Award, and also for the World Fantasy Award. So you can see at this point, by 1993, because Ellison had very few mass market books out there by that point, to a younger readership, it was falling away. The magazines weren't as popular by then as they had been in the 1960s and 1970s. So his ability to win awards was starting to slide because he'd been so predominant winning them in the 60s and 70s. Now, Mephisto in Onyx has similarities to Robert Silverberg's Dying Inside. It's a very black horror story about a serial killer who has been captured and is on death row. And the woman who has effectively sealed his fate, an attorney, realizes she's in love with him, and she knows a telepath who can get inside his soul and see whether he really did commit the crimes he's accused of, because she has her doubts. It's a story that has various twists, and for me, the twists happen too much towards the end. They're not effectively planned enough. They don't entirely convince. But this is a good story. It is a story about somebody focusing excessively on their self. And in that way, it reminds me a lot of Dying Inside. But it is not as accomplished, really. And I've never really liked Mephisto in Onyx very much. The writing is absolutely fine. but in terms of the construct and the way it's put together, it never really convinced me, and I think it's one of the weaker things and maybe shouldn't have been in here, but it's in here because of all those nominations. To end that section, there's a story called On the Downhill Side from 1972, which was in Deathbird Stories. It was nominated for the Locus Award and the Nebula Award. It's a very beautiful story. It has unicorns in it. It's quite melancholy and elegiac. I always enjoy reading it. It does put you in a very sort of gloomy mood, but also quite a soft mood. And Ellison was good at that sort of things. He wrote quite a few stories like that. There's one called Nothing for My Noon Meal, I think it is, which I really like, and there's one called Lonely Ache as well, which they're absolutely fantastic. He did have a very sensitive side, and he had a very bristling side as well. We then move on to the section called The Passage of Time, and that opens with a story from the mid-80s, Paladin of the Lost Hour, which I think is just a wonderful, wonderful title, Paladin of the Lost Hour. This won the Hugo Award, the Locus Award, the Nebula Award nomination, and it was turned into a Twilight Zone episode. I've never seen that one, actually. And it is about somebody who is the guardian of a lost hour. And I'm not going to tell you how this hour becomes lost and what this hour means, but it does involve the fate of the universe. And it's a beautifully written story. It really, really is fantastic. It has a central protagonist of colour. There are several protagonists of colour that pop up in this book. And I'm mentioning that for a specific reason. I'll talk about that later on. That's followed by one of my favourite stories by Ellison, the title story from the collection, The Beast That Shouted Love at the Heart of the World from 1969. I've always loved that title, The Beast That Shouted Love at the Heart of the World, and it won the Hugo Award. It's an experimental story which begins with a man committing an act of violence against his community, which is really, really shocking, and then it flips to an entirely different scenario on an alien planet, and it really does feel very, very alien, and it absolutely glitters with Ellison's carefully chosen prose, the way he selects words and the way that he loves words really comes through in this story. And it's one of the very best new wave science fiction stories to come out of America, in my opinion. I've read it numerous times and I absolutely love it. As I say, if you go to the video linked at the end of this video, you'll hear an in-depth review of that particular book that story is the title story of. Then we have a story which fundamentally didn't win any awards, but it's in here, and it's a very funny story, and it's called I'm Looking for Kadak, and it comes from 1974, and it's about how can I put this? It's about a Jewish alien who lives on a world called Zushmoon, and he has something like 11 legs and 3 arms or something. And I first read an illustrated edition. It's a very funny story, and it's narrated by this Jewish alien. And yeah, how can we have Jews in other worlds? That's the thing. It's very, very funny. And Ellison himself was Jewish, so a lot of it's in Yiddish, and I don't know Yiddish, but because of the context you can work it out. And it's a really, really funny, charming story, and it ends on a really nice note, and it represents Ellison at his most playful and childlike and lovable, and I absolutely love it. I'm Looking for Kadak. Very funny story. Great, great stuff. Love it. And the section then closes with a story I wasn't familiar with, which won the Nebula Award in 2010, and that's called How Interesting, A Tiny Man. And it's a first-person narrative of a guy who creates a homunculus, a tiny man, a little man. He builds his own mini sort of Frankenstein, and it's just great. It's about how people respond to this novelty of this tiny man, and then unfortunately the media get hold of it. And it's a very brief story. It's 10 pages, but it's absolutely charming. But it reminded me of a story by Kit Reed in which a guy buys a toy tiger for his nephew, and he imbues it with its own life. It does remind me of that story, which I covered in another video. But that was one I hadn't read, and that was really nice to read, because most of these were sort of old hat to me. Then the section, The Lighter Side, opens with Gin No Chaser. That's gin as in a genie. DJINN, won the Locus Award. And this is fairly typical of Ellison. Did quite a few stories about sort of curiosity shops, the sort of thing that Ray Bradbury was really good at. And you can see the influence of Bradbury in this story. It actually reminds me of a story I think is superior in this book, Saturday, which is called Shopkeeper. And shop is spelt in the Old English way, Shoppe, shopkeeper, and that's a great story, it really is. But I enjoyed reading Gin No Chaser again. It's got some comedic elements, very, very good. And as I say, we're in the lighter side section of the book. Then, probably his most outrageous story in terms of humour is the very wonderful How's the Nightlife on Cisalda from 1977, again from Saturday. I put this here because there's 4 stories in here from Saturday, and I think Saturday's an underrated collection, so if you ever see it, pick it up. And How's the Nightlife on Cisalda is a brilliant story about a guy who is kind of an astronaut. He is projected into an alternate universe in an experimental program, and he comes back and something is attached to him, something which you could say is parasitic, except it's not. This thing that's attached to him finds the astronaut or explorer, whatever you want to call him, interdimensional traveller. It finds him very, very attractive indeed. And all of a sudden, the aliens from the other dimension start popping up into our universe and having erotic relations with everybody. And it's a hilarious story, very, very funny. There is one more outrageous story which I would name if I could recall, which is in Deathbird Stories, but that's more outrageously violent, but it's a similar sort of thing. But it's really, really funny story, and I always love reading it, and it sort of made me laugh aloud when I first read it when I bought Saturday, and it's always a joy to go back to. Then we have a story called From A to Z in the Chocolate Alphabet from 1976, which I didn't know, and I felt this was very slight. It's more experimental. Is it actually funny? I didn't think it was funny. As I say, it's more experimental, it's episodic, it doesn't really have a linear narrative that I could pick out. And yeah, I wondered about that one. That to me was one of the weakest ones in here, and I think it's only in here because it had a lighter side section. The lighter side section closes with a story called Eidolons from 1989, which won the Locus Award. And again, quite a slight story, but a good one. It wasn't one I remembered reading, though I probably have read it, because a lot of the later collections I've only read once and I'm not so familiar with them. And that's a good one, but again, I'm not certain it was a lighter story. I'm really not certain of that at all. It struck me as quite serious, but there you go. And then the book closes with the longest piece in it, All the Lives That Are My Life, from 1981, which was nominated for the Hugo Award. And All the Lives That Are My Life really is not a science fiction or fantasy story at all. It's a work of general fiction, but it does have its basis in the world of SF. And it's the first person narrative of a writer called Larry Bedlow, who attends the funeral of a friend of his, another writer, who has passed away. And his friend has been a more successful writer, a far more successful writer. And a number of people are invited to the reading of the will, and Larry is one of them, to see what the legacy will be. And there are various flashback moments where Larry and his friend get together and they talk about their relative careers. And there's a certain amount of envy from Larry towards the other writer. And the theory is the story is based loosely on the friendly rivalry between Harlan Ellison and Robert Silverberg, because they used to sort of effectively live in the same apartment building at one point, very early on in the late 50s when they were both building their careers. And I think the theory is that Ellison was slightly envious of Silverberg, who won a Hugo Award very quickly and then moved away from the field in the 1960s to return incredibly for a number of years in the late 60s through till the late 70s, when he just did some most astonishing work in genre SF ever. And it's a great story. I have to say, when I first read it, when I was only about 19, I thought it was really, really quite something. I thought it was a really serious piece of literature. And I still think it's really good, but it's not actually as good as I recall. So I am going to go back to it again and give it another try. It is a thoughtful piece. It is a good piece, and I love it a lot, but it isn't quite as accomplished in the sense of a mainstream piece of writing as I thought it would be. And it does have an ending which doesn't quite come across with the seriousness and bitterness that I first sensed in it. So maybe that's me changing, but it's nonetheless a great story. What do I think overall about this collection? I think there are several things which I would have dropped from it, but as I say, it was made on the basis of award winning and things like that. There are some stories which won awards, were nominated, which are not in here, so I'm not entirely certain about that, but hopefully the Ellison estate and Herald Classics will be doing more Ellison retrospectives. It would be really nice to see some proper reissues in mass market format of the actual collections as Ellison chose them, because he was very big on having themes for his collections. So something like Deathbird Stories was subtitled A Pantheon of Modern Gods. I seem to remember that Alone Against Tomorrow was subtitled something like Stories of Alienation and Speculative Fiction. Approaching Oblivion was about steps on the way to Armageddon. So he used to have themes when he constructed the collections. Occasionally popular stories would pop up in more than one collection, and he would sometimes be accused of mining his best stories to fill out the collections. But very often thematically it worked really, really well. I mean, he did this a few times, so I'm not entirely sure myself that was a valid criticism. Because he relied on short stories for most of his income, I don't think there was anything wrong with that, because very often they would be contextualized newly by the stories around them and were very, very carefully chosen indeed. So the most important thing is that you can go out now, you can go to a bookshop in the UK or in the States, so you can go online and you can buy this and get a very handsome book, and you can read Harlan Ellison for the first time. And now on to the problems with the book. For some of us, this is a controversial volume, but not because of Ellison's writing. It's a controversial volume because of things which have been inserted or removed from the text, which have, quite frankly, infuriated some of us in the Ellison fan-based community. So I'm going to talk about those things, and it's mostly in the supplemental material. There's an introduction by Neil Gaiman. Now, I'm not a massive fan of Neil Gaiman. I don't think he's a great writer, but he does have impeccable taste. And if every Neil Gaiman fan who bought Neil's books went out there and read the writers that Neil raves about, like Ellison, like Delaney and Peter S. Beagle, we would be in a far better place. So I'm good with that, and Neil knew Ellison and absolutely fine. So could I think of somebody better? Probably. I probably would have gone with Silverberg, but Neil Gaiman is the name which is going to draw people in. And as I say, Ellison is a writer I think that young people should read, very, very much so, because he's full of fire, passion and verve about the things which matter. So I'm cool with that. The book is edited by J. Michael Straczynski, who is presumably responsible not only for the selection, but for the trigger warnings in this book, which I believe very strongly that Harlan Ellison would have disapproved of. And these trigger warnings have really got my goat, and I'm sure there's other people who feel the same. Let me just have a look. What you get in here, I'm just going to find the first one, and it says a note on the text. Harlan Ellison's work epitomized and reshaped the speculative, science fiction and horror genres across decades. His stories and novellas have been an inspiration to subsequent writers, and his impact can still be seen in contemporary television, culture and literature. This is all true, though that impact is more invisible now than it has been for a long time. This note on the text goes on to say, however, while these stories are outstanding works across multiple genres, they may contain outdated cultural representation and language. We present the works as originally published. We hope that you enjoy discovering or rediscovering these stories. Okay, so they're saying the text isn't changed, but they are effectively putting a trigger warning in. No mature reader, and by mature reader, I don't mean how old you are. I mean a reader who is willing to understand that fiction is fiction and that writers must be free to use whatever vocabulary they need to get their stories across to a fictive mode is just... I just cannot understand it. So that it's a kind of censorship. It's saying, ooh, you know, this might scare you. That does not work for me at all. If you want to read the great works of literature from Homer to Shakespeare to Cervantes, anything, you cannot be afraid of words. And also fiction is fiction. The words of a character, the attitude of a character, acts described, are not essentially approved of by the writer. More often than not, they're not approved of. And particularly, I would say what is being referred to here are some of the racial terms in the book. Now, Ellison, as I say, was a champion of civil rights. He wasn't racist, but he was willing to use language which people would have found racist then and they would find it racist now, in the mouths of the characters, the narrators, what have you. That's because he wanted to show the ugliness of the words and how horrible they were. But at the same time, he came out of a spirit in the 1960s similar to Lenny Bruce, where the words themselves, if repeated enough, become meaningless. And that's an important thing. And in the 1960s, in the UK, we had the last obscenity trials affecting books, and we had a liberalism, and people were allowed to write and read what they wanted. And this was really important. And that's where a story like Repent, Harlequin said, the TikTok man, is really significant. And I think Ellison would have been disgusted by the actual trigger warning here. Now, the theory is, what has been said about this is that they put that in to ensure this book got into American schools. Now, I really don't care about that. Where I want to see this book is in bookshops. If it's in schools, it's a good thing. I read my first Harlan Ellison book in a school. It was in my school library, and I want them to be in school libraries. It's the sort of book that's going to get banned from lots of American school libraries anyway. That happens all the time. The main thing is the author must not be censored, and the reader who is willing to read science fiction, fantasy and horror should have an open mind and be ready to read these words, no matter how shocking they may feel they are. Because with shock comes revelation, and hopefully comes a greater understanding. And that's what Ellison wanted, a greater understanding. So I was a bit annoyed about that, to say the least. What's worse is that when you come to I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, there are sections which in the original printings of the story are in a kind of computer language, and you see them peppering the text, and they are changed. Here, for example, there, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. They're stated boldly, and Ellison didn't put those things in. He wanted you to work them out. He wanted you to look into what was being used, and you know, they're sort of boldly stuck in there. I mean, are we in an age where people can't dig anymore? We have the internet, people can look things up, but people are lazy, they don't. So it's a real shame. So there have actually been alterations to the text. Now, worst of all is you get quite a way in to Mephisto and Onyx, which I critique quite a lot. And when you get to Mephisto and Onyx, there's a massive trigger warning. Now, the central character of Mephisto and Onyx, the narrator, the protagonist, is a man of colour. So you get the title, Mephisto and Onyx, then you get a content warning. At the time in which this story was written, it was not uncommon for authors, especially Ellison, to use charged terminology when confronting the racism behind those words. Harlan believed that you cannot fight racism with velvet gloves and polite manners. It had to be called out plainly and punched in the mouth as hard as possible. Consequently, there are terms here that may cause offence. That was the intent, but time and an evolving culture have changed the target and the impact of those words, so reader discretion is advised. Change the impact of those words. Change the target. Have they really? It's still the same thing that Ellison would have fought against. And what is interesting about this is that the protagonist of colour uses the N-word and a variant of it toward himself. And that was common in gangster rap. So it's there. So you've got to think about what that means. But the presence of these things really does make me worry for the future. And it makes me worry about censorship, the censorship that is mentioned in stories like Repent, Harlequin. So there's a kind of irony here as well. And I have to say, there's also a introduction by Cassandra Kaur, whoever she is. And Cassandra Kaur is a Malaysian SF writer and horror writer. She's published 4 or 5 books. She's won various awards the last few years. The trouble with these awards these days is that they are sort of shot through with elements of identity politics, political correctness, and dare we say nepotism, and they don't have the same credibility they used to. I'll admit I've not read her work. It might be brilliant, though I do have my doubts. But I thought, why is it being introduced by her? And she says in her introduction about sexism and how Ellison could have written better. She praises him, but she also damns him, and she clearly does not understand that Ellison's power, savagery and uncompromising approach to the issues in these stories of sex and violence, of oppression, of racism, of sexism, was powerful because he put it in the most powerful terms. Ellison's writing isn't just about anger, it's also about compassion and love and tenderness, but it's mostly about injustice. He was an angry, ireful man, but he wanted everybody to be treated decently, and he wanted people to treat people decently. And that comes across in these stories, even in their most savage moments. If editors, introducers, readers can't see that, they need to go back and read again. It's a difficult thing. I can see why people feel the need to put explanations and caveats around these stories. And, you know, if it gets into people's hands, is that a good thing? Well, I don't like to compromise on these things, and I don't think Ellison would have either. I think you just need to read these things and be mature and accept that outdated cultural representation is a horrible thing to write, because in 10 years' time, if you're so focused on the now that you can't look back and look at what you read 10 years ago without seeing it as an outdated cultural representation, you are never going to appreciate the great literature and history of the past. So I'm going to leave you with that. I'm delighted this is out. I do buy it. I know loads of people have bought this, even though we've got everything in it. It's lovely to have an Ellison in print. So if you're new to his work, get out there and buy this, and then seek out more of his works. This is Outlaw Bookseller signing out for now. Please subscribe, comment, like, super thanks, all that stuff, and I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.